Yeah, USB-C. Okay. You got one of those?
I'm full battery.
All right, we're at 7 o'clock. We're going to start the training portion of our meeting for the next half hour, then move into our regular agenda. And for training, tonight we have, as part of the discussion, Jennifer is going to share latest relative to SEQRA, specifically around disadvantaged communities, right?
Yes.
The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So we touched on this a little bit last month during one of our SEQRA reviews for a project, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail for the next half hour. So the New York State Legislature has made amendments to the Environmental Conservation Law, which is the statute that SEQRA comes from. So the Environmental Conservation Law, Article 8, provides the requirements that we have to consider environmental impacts as part of every proposed action, and then DEC creates the regulations, promulgates the regulations that implement that requirement. So here we have amendments to the Environmental Conservation Law, the statute, which now require lead agencies to consider environmental justice issues when conducting its environmental review under SEQRA. DEC is still working on the regulations to implement that. So we're going to talk a little bit today about what was amended in the Environmental Conservation Law, but there's still a lot of unknowns as far as how DEC, the implementing agency, intends for that to actually happen. So some of this is to be determined once the regulations are finalized. They were proposed at the beginning of 2025, and the final rule has not come out yet. So we'll get into all of that as we go through. So what is EJSL? EJSL is the term for the amendments to the Environmental Conservation Law related to environmental justice, called the Environmental Justice Siting Law. These provisions actually took effect at the end of last year, but as I mentioned, again, we don't have DEC regulations kind of giving the instructions on how that's going to get implemented.
Sorry, real quick, so that means
yeah.
they've been adopted.
The statute has been amended to require this assessment, but exactly what is involved in the assessment has not been promulgated by DEC yet.
You.
Yeah. So the purpose of the Environmental Justice Siting Law is when adopting the amendments to the Environmental Conservation Law, the state legislature recognized that as a result of inequitable patterns in siting certain environmental facilities, that minority and economically distressed communities are bearing a greater environmental health burden due to these inequities from the cumulative pollution exposure from multiple facilities. So when implementing SEQRA, the legislature is now requiring that we look at whether the proposed action may cause or may increase a disproportionate pollution burden on these disadvantaged communities. And you're going to hear me say disadvantaged communities a lot. That's a defined term in the statute, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is, but it goes by the acronym DAC or DAC. So how does the environmental justice siting law affect how we currently do our SEQRA reviews? So even though we don't have the final regulations, the final adopted regulations from DEC, the Environmental Conservation Law, the statute, still does require that we evaluate environmental justice issues. DEC has provided interim guidance while it's going through its rulemaking process, and has basically said you should use our draft materials in order to implement this requirement while we're finalizing the actual rules.
I have a quick question. Do they have a mapping tool because that's usually the center of these kind of
Yes.
things, and the mapping tool tells you what the air quality is, the number of different types of facilities, the incomes, makeup, demographics, all the stuff that would enable you to.
Yes, and I have a slide on that in a couple more slides, and if the link works, we can actually go into that mapping tool and see what it looks like for Beacon. So there are draft materials available on the DEC website. Those include the draft text amendments to the SEQRA regulations, draft revisions to the EAFs, both the short form and the full environmental assessment form, draft guidance for the workbooks. So the workbooks are the interactive tool that DEC created a couple years ago to help with each question on the EAF. There's a clickable link on the EAF that'll bring you to sort of a question and answer and further information about each of those questions on the EAF and how to implement it. So there's draft guidance about environmental justice in that document, and then just sort of a frequently asked questions guidance document from DEC. So all that is available on their website, and I can send you links to that information after tonight's session. So there are two instances where this will come up in our SEQRA review. The first is when we're taking the step of determining significance. So determining whether or not there is a significant adverse environmental impact as a result of the project. And in that step, we're going to consider whether the action may cause or may increase a disproportionate pollution burden on a disadvantaged community, or DAC. The second time it'll come up is if you have issued a positive declaration, so you've already found that there may be one or more significant adverse environmental impacts, and you're in an EIS process, an environmental impact statement process, and there the EIS is required to assess whether the impacts of that proposed action on a DAC may increase or cause a disproportionate pollution burden. So I keep talking about these disadvantaged communities, DACs. So what exactly are they? The Environmental Conservation Law defines DACs as communities that bear burdens of negative public health effects, environmental pollution, impacts of climate change, and possess certain socioeconomic criteria, or comprise high concentrations of low and moderate income households, as identified pursuant to a particular section in the Environmental Conservation Law. So we go to that particular section of the Environmental Conservation Law and we find out how DACs were identified. So section 75-0111 of the Environmental Conservation Law created what's called the Climate Justice Working Group. And this group's job was to establish criteria to identify disadvantaged communities throughout New York State. So they use criteria like geography and public health, environmental hazards, and socioeconomic criteria to figure out exactly where, based on census tracts, where these disadvantaged communities are located, so lead agencies can focus their attention on those communities when an action comes before them.
Can I ask another question? Sorry.
Yeah.
Can a community, what's the size of a community? Can a community be an area within a city?
It's so they use census tract, so
Okay.
it's per census tract. So it's going to depend on the population of that census tract as far as the size is concerned. And we'll go through the map that shows where the Climate Justice Working Group found disadvantaged communities throughout New York State. There's one map that they created, and then there's a second map that DEC created to kind of drill down further to look at the burdens in each of those communities and their vulnerability. So some of the things that the Climate Justice Working Group considered are areas that are burdened by cumulative environmental pollution or other hazards that can lead to negative public health effects. So if you have a community where there's a concentration of industrial uses, power plants, things that would, highways cutting through the community, creating additional air pollution, and because of inequitable patterns of siting these things, they tended to be concentrated in a disadvantaged area. So those could be areas with concentrations of people that have low income, high unemployment, high rent burden, low levels of home ownership, low levels of educational attainment, and these are all from the Climate Working Group's website, which I can share with you as well. Also areas that have historically experienced discrimination based on race or ethnicity, and also areas that are vulnerable to impacts of climate change, like flooding and storm surges. So you can potentially have a relatively affluent community, but that community might be disadvantaged because they're in a very vulnerable physical location, geographic location, and subject to impacts of climate change. So this working group had quite a task of looking at all of those various criteria and various factors and determining where disadvantaged communities are located. So actually, I'm going to switch these got in the wrong order. So this is the map, and I had it focused, a little snip focused on our area. You can't really, you could barely see you could see the Hudson kind of in the shaded pattern cutting down through Beacon and between Beacon and Newburgh. But this is an example of the map that was created by the Climate Justice Working Group that identified by census tract areas where there are disadvantaged communities. Now there are supposed to be layers available on this map where you can look at the burden that the working group looked at, like how the disadvantaged community was burdened, whether there's location of a landfill, traffic issues, air pollution issues, flooding risk, and then also the type of vulnerability that was assessed to that community, whether it be poverty, housing insecurity, unemployment, etc. So I'm going to try to click on this link and see if it'll take us to the, yep, there we go. So we click down. So there is the map in all of New York State. All those purple areas are where the Climate Justice Working Group determined there are disadvantaged communities. And we can scroll in. If it'll let me.
You could just type Beacon at the top, it'll let you.
Let her drag.
In the search.
Stop me, it's mine.
There we go. There we go. Thanks, John. So we can see Beacon is actually divided up into two census tracts based on this. The northern part of Beacon, the map tells us that the environmental burden on the northern census tract in Beacon is higher than 94% of the other census tracts statewide. And in terms of vulnerability, that census tract is higher than 69% of the census tract statewide. Now, if we scroll down here, we can see how the working group categorized each of these particular indicators of disadvantaged communities. And you can see it talks about, asthma, emergency department visits, heart attack hospitalizations, low birth weight, percentage of the population with disabilities, percentage without health insurance. So they really went into like a high level of detail in looking at various demographics. And then on the right side here in yellow, we see more of the land use and physical aspects of the community. So active landfills, 0%. However, industrial, manufacturing, mining, et cetera, 85% was the rate that they got as far as.
Yeah, I know.
How does that track? How does that track?
For, Beacon is
No,
has
the-
a lot of industrial sites, right? Former industrial sites.
Former industrial.
Yeah.
That are probably still contaminated in some way.
They're still
Some may
designated
be,
brownfield,
right.
or?
There's several remediation sites. So for example, on the EAF mapper that you see that comes in with each EAF, almost every single EAF that we see on properties in Beacon, it comes up as, yes, it's within 2,000 feet of a site that was subject to
Ah.
remediation through DEC. It's usually sites that have already been cleaned up, so it's not an issue, but that particular category almost always triggers for almost any project in Beacon.
Yeah, so, because, there are a lot of, especially along the creek,
Yeah.
that have formerly been designated as brownfields or,
Right.
containing contaminants, but then they've been remediated, so.
Exactly.
Wouldn't this take that into account? I guess not.
Possibly. It's been hard to kind of drill down to really understand exactly the criteria and how the working group got to this 85%.
Yeah.
I mean, we have this data, but we don't have like the raw numbers and the raw
Yeah,
information that they use.
what they built that from.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, and ultimately, it comes down to sort of the genesis of one of my questions. How ultimately does this designation for Beacon specifically translate into our reviews? I would imagine that the update is that this is just another level of review that we'll have to go into relative to SEQRA on certain parcels, or
Exactly.
on all parcels?
On
all-
most
on our parcels
parcels.
subject to SEQRA.
Yeah, because so this is the map now that DEC created that helps you kind of identify within those census tracts, whether there are, exactly how burdened and how vulnerable the areas are. So the orange are areas that have comparatively higher existing burdens or vulnerabilities, and therefore an increased likelihood that citing a proposed action that has some kind of pollution aspect to it may have a moderate to large impact on that community, versus the areas in blue have comparatively lower existing burdens and vulnerabilities. And again, if we click on this will take us to, and you could play around with these maps, in your spare time. If you're looking for something to do. We don't have that handy search tool that was on the other one, so we've got to physically scroll here. But you can see, if we scroll in and look at Beacon, keep zooming in here, most of Beacon is in the orange, which is identified as having comparatively higher burdens and vulnerabilities. There's an area here up by Beacon High School that's in blue, and then an area, this tract here, which most of which is in Beacon along 9D, Howland Avenue. This was found to not be a DAC at all. So if we were to receive an application for a property within this area, the DAC or environmental justice analysis would not be applicable unless that site was actually within half a mile. Because they want to make sure that even if you're not in a DAC, if you're DAC adjacent, you're still doing the analysis to make sure the impacts of your project are not going to impact the DAC.
So they'd all be doing it regardless then?
For most of Beacon, yes, yeah. Let me get back to map. So again, we're doing this analysis when we are in sort of step 3 from prior SEQRA presentations that we've done, the determination of significance stage. And part of what DEC is amending in its regulations is to add to the section entitled Determining Significance a requirement that we have to look at whether an action may cause or increase a disproportionate pollution burden on DACs. This is a slide that shows the amendments to the short EAF that DEC is considering, and it adds a question to identify whether the project is located within or within a half mile of a DAC. If no, could the impacts of the project nevertheless impact that disadvantaged community? And if the answer is yes to either of those questions, then we have to look at identifying whether the impacts of that project will negatively affect the DAC. The questions down at the bottom of the slide here are from the part 2 of the EAF, where we do that analysis. Similarly, this is the page in the full environmental assessment form that includes the disadvantaged communities analysis. We don't have to go through all of those questions, but just know that they're there. And again, we're going to be, when we're looking at an EIS or a draft environmental impact statement, that's where we're going to be looking at the information about whether or not, once something has been identified as being potentially significant, whether that project is going to negatively impact the DAC. And again, DEC is working on updates to its SEQRA regulations to specifically incorporate that into the EIS process, that analysis. So these are some of the resources. These are all clickable links, and I can provide you with the PowerPoint presentation.
Sure. Yeah.
One other thing that I should mention that is included in the DEC amendments to the SEQRA regulations is a new type 2 action. So unrelated to environmental justice or DACs, the construction of a multi-family building with 4 or more dwelling units is now a type 2 action, so requiring no environmental review, but only if it meets certain criteria. And that includes where the gross floor area doesn't exceed 10,000 square feet. It's on an approved lot, connected to existing public water and sewer, so no septic or wells. It's a permitted use under the zoning code. And the proposed action, it would include the construction of things like sidewalks and parking areas and landscaping. That the whole proposed action would be considered type 2. So it'll be interesting to see. I think the 10,000 square foot limitation for 4 or more dwelling units, I don't know how many. It's a relatively small building, I think, for 4 or more dwelling units. So we'll see how impactful this particular type 2 is, but that's a new one that will be coming online when the final regs are adopted.
Do you have a timeline for when? So, for example, at this moment, are we reviewing applications with this new?
Yes, we will be
We will.
reviewing. Yeah, so it's, like I said, it's a requirement in the statute, but we don't have the actual regulations yet. But in the interim, DEC said, yes, you should be looking at disadvantaged communities in your SEQRA reviews, and use our interim guidance, our draft documents to assist in that review. So we'll be incorporating that into our SEQRA reviews. And then as far as the timing for when the final regs are going to be available, we don't know. I was at a conference about a month and a half ago, and a SEQRA conference for the 50th anniversary of SEQRA up in Albany. And the first time that someone from DEC got up to speak and on one of the panels, of course, that was one of the big questions that was asked, when are we going to see these regulations? And they had no idea.
answer.
They had no idea. So yet to be determined.
But
when we'll actually see the
effectively,
final.
it is in effect.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Yeah.
All right. Have we missed certain applications that would fall under this requirement, or?
Well, we incorporated it into a SEQRA review we did
Okay.
last month, and we'll continue to do that going forward.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Okay.
Looks like we're short a couple of members still. David's expected.